Dan with Staffing Monthly, and we are digging into one of my favorite topics here, talking about recruitment optimization. Obviously, we know that we are in incredibly challenging labor market. There are literally 10 million unfilled positions out there because the labor force seemingly is just not there. So we are in an incredibly high demand, low supply market, which makes the pressure on the recruiter to fill all of their orders incredibly high. And in order to do that, there's certain things that you can do, resources, techniques that you can actually utilize to increase your chances of success. And today's guest, Trevor Gamble of the Refine Group, is going to teach us exactly that. Now, before I bring Trevor on, just a quick background. He actually has a lot of training experience. If you look at his background, he has worked in training for some of the biggest household name brands, especially in the lifestyle brand space, if you check that out, which I think is really cool. But he also has nearly 5 years in the recruitment industry, where based on his success in recruitment management and training there, he decided to launch the Refine Group to teach other staffing and recruiting agencies how to optimize their recruitment so they can increase their chances for success. And I'm excited to dig into what he's working on today and the results that his clients are seeing. So Trevor, thank you so much for being here with Staffing Monthly. I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me. It's a privilege, honor to be on the show.
So you mentioned, before I jump right into the main question, like you've worked for some really cool companies. Like if you're scrolling through the LinkedIn, you're like a lifestyle brand guy. I'm seeing Oakley and Red Bull and GoPro. Like, you know, that's amazing. Like, is that like kind of who you are? Like, are you kind of an outdoor adventure like athlete? Like, is that your deal?
Yeah, the man behind the polo shirt is definitely my passion. As a younger person, I fell in love with snowboarding during my teens and grew up in Massachusetts, where there's not a lot of that lifestyle. So I made my way west, moved to Colorado to go to college, and just fell head over heels into that lifestyle and pursued a career in the action sports and consumer products industry for about 10 or 11 years before making a big change.
I think that's so cool, man. I love like action sports, lifestyle brands. They're so amazing. So just kind of being in that arena must have been pretty incredible.
I have to say, is quite a privilege. A lot of incredible experiences. Saw a lot of the United States and some of the other countries too. So
that's amazing. And then you switched. You went from action sports into recruitment, essentially. It was kind of your last stop before the Refine Group. So what was that transition like, going from like, you know, training and field marketing and that side of the action sports brand over into recruitment, where you spent a few years? Like, what is that transition like, and what did you learn kind of through that journey?
yeah, well, that's a great and interesting question. When I was in consumer product marketing for 10 or 11 years, there was this gap that existed with my skill set, where I knew and worked with sales team members all the time, sort of left-hand, right-hand relationship, but I didn't understand their ecosystem. And as I was getting close to 30 years old, I really wanted to. Without going on a long backstory, I made the voluntary decision to leave that industry and venture into sales in a very kind of roundabout way. So recruiting wasn't the exact next step. I got married. My wife and I moved from Southern California to Arizona, where she originally grew up. And I had a brief stint as a business broker for small market businesses before, like many would say, you know, kind of falling into recruiting.
Right. That's how everyone gets in. Like, nobody actually intentionally goes into recruiting, I swear. You know, I interview so many people and I'm like, how'd you get into this? Like, oh, it's kind of by accident. I'm like as is everybody else.
Yeah.
All right. So
such is my story.
So you cut your teeth in recruiting, you do a variety there, and then you're like, hey, my passion for training is coming back to me. I've learned how to be successful in recruiting. And then you launch the Refine Group, which that's what your focus is you actually focus on helping staffing and recruiting organizations recruit better, increase their chances of success, especially in a tight labor market. So my big question for you today is what is the biggest thing that you're teaching your clients right now? And then the follow-on where I want to go is like, what are the results they're getting from that?
Yeah. And as I was thinking about the question, there are so many directions to potentially take this. I mean, you've welcomed some incredible experienced recruiting leaders onto the show. So I feel like nearly every topic has been covered at least at some point. Where I've been seeing traction with what I'm teaching, particularly recently, is with marketing, recruiters marketing themselves. And I want to be conscientious not to say like as authorities necessarily, but one of the things that's become so apparent, particularly in the trailing, few years, I think, is recruiters branding themselves appropriately so that the talent, they become aware that this is a person who is involved in my space. They are credible. They care about the industry that I'm in. Forgive the term, but they're not some fly-by-night individual who's just kind of here today and gone tomorrow. So in summary, really recruiter branding has been a very important recurring topic for me, among other hard skills that I've been working with recruiters on.
So that's interesting. I know that earlier in the year when we were digging into the recruiting quadrant, recruitment marketing is certainly one of those. And I would say recruiter branding falls squarely into that. And I feel like the recruiting industry is a little bit, I don't want to say late to the game, but we know that real estate agents, once they focused on really going into that personal branding, it became the norm about how real estate agents, and the more successful ones, they do it better. Then it moved into kind of big ticket consumer sales, like car sales, right? Like when you're doing that, the car sales people that would focus on their brand and say, hey, I'm going to be here, I'm not going anywhere, I'm not your typical car salesperson. They focus on that personal brand. They started seeing success. And I think recruiters, even though we're not selling a consumer product like a house or a car or something like that that's tangible, we still have that same type of interaction with people. So I think that that's an interesting approach. So what are your go-tos? Like, what do you focus on? Like, do you have a framework that you teach recruiters on how to improve their brand, a checklist? Like, what's your go-to?
Sure. There are other people who have walked this path before me who I've really been in a way, a student of. Courtney Harmon, she's currently with Crelate. She has a really solid framework. Joe Mullings from Mullings Group, also I started paying attention to him very closely when I was first entering into the recruiting space. He has a very solid framework. So it's not a bespoke approach by any means. It's more of an iteration on what I've learned from them. And I think what this really kind of boils down to is, if we frame this as a newcomer to the recruiting industry, right? They're learning how to recruit. They're also learning how to potentially niche down into one or maybe two vertical industries. And it's becoming truly a student of those industries or that one industry. What do the people who I'm going to be speaking with and trying to recruit care about? What matters to them? What news are they reading? What are they consuming? I think it really starts there. And I know how high level and kind of vague that seems, but that's where it's got to begin, because nobody could necessarily pinpoint, if I spend my time here on this topic, this subject matter, I can really distinguish myself as the go-to recruiter in the space. And furthermore, it grows over time. So I believe really kind of the first step is to have the recruiter, whether it's their recruiting manager or the firm leader, encourage them to become a consumer of the content, looking at relevant media, looking at tastemakers and key opinion leaders in that particular space, and really cataloging that. When I first began, I put together sort of a who's who or a top 20 or 30 list of key opinion leaders for the wireless and telecom market, which is where I started to do a lot of recruiting.
Okay.
Then as I got further down that trail in wireless and telecom, I realized that I had a real affinity for recruiting and developing relationships with more the hardware development engineers. So I started paying attention to wireless and telecom, but electrical engineering specific subjects. And that's where I learned about the trade publications, and that's where I learned who the tastemakers were in that space and following their content. So it's almost like as a boulder kind of gets momentum as it starts tumbling downhill, the newcomer will start to get more and more momentum and pick up these things along the way that I would say that one of the more important things is to be very diligent about catalog what you find and sift and sort. This is a great resource. This is an okay resource. Yeah.
So that's interesting, and I like the organization of cataloging. So, but to me, when I hear that part of it, it's almost an early step of immersion to basically start to become that at least knowledge expert, for the industry that you're serving. You said niche down, which is a great approach. You can't be a master of everything, right? So if you niche down, you pick one industry, two industries, or types of professions that you really want to focus in, and you do this and you catalog well, I feel like it's going to immerse you to let you be an expert. But how do you flip that to where people then know who you are? Like, how do you amplify your brand from there to start, I guess, recruiting better or attracting better talent?
And that's a key moment. I don't know exactly when it comes online for each individual person. Part of it's comfort level, part of it's timeline, part of it's the number of candidate conversations they've been able to have within a certain window. But I think combining all of those different elements, right? Like the recruiters, some apply themselves more diligently than others, and they can consume a year's worth of content in a quarter. Others, it may take them an entire year to do that. So compositing these things is about understanding if I'm going to be sharing, if I'm a recruiter who's going to be contributing my voice to the broader market, sharing content, repurposing content, and this goes back to Joe Mulling's approach, which I learned 3-4 years ago. I don't just want to be copying and pasting. That's not adding new and unique value.
Right.
On the other hand, I also don't want to be trying to masquerade as like the subject matter authority, because if we're really in the spirit of recruitment, there are incredibly talented people out there who have 10, 15, 20 years of experience in the field that we're recruiting. We can't mirror that. Like if I started today, I couldn't become a semiconductor engineer if I had the rest of my life.
Right. I get that.
So, to kind of bring this together, it's about having engaged with enough content, having had enough candidate calls to understand if I'm sharing something, how can I add a unique perspective and or bring value to the audience? Doing that continually and regularly is obviously going to gain more attention. The person's network is going to grow. It's also going to reflect to the market, potential talent. Oh, this is somebody who actually does care. They're not just putting a sort of new and improved label on something that they've picked up from a news source or reposting, as is the case with a lot of social media. They're actually taking the time to understand what they're reading, learn about it, and apply an insight and apply a perspective, and perhaps even add some new value to me. Because also, I think that in recruitment, it's very easy to overlook that the individuals we recruit, they don't always have all the time in the world to consume news about their own industry sector. So if there's a connection via LinkedIn and they consume something in the feed that enlightens them about their industry, that's very meaningful. And that brings things full circle, because therein the recruiter is kind of distinguishing themselves as somebody that care about the industry and they care about bringing new value and really kind of enhancing the careers of people in that space.
So you just hit on something. I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, because you pointed out the fact that there's already experts in a space. If you're recruiting for an industry, there's already going to be industry thought leaders and all of those kind of, best of the 20 or top 30, and you've got them cataloged. Like, what, in my opinion, what value could the recruiter really add that those people aren't? And would it make more sense, instead of them trying to talk about, the electrical engineering industry or that kind of stuff, like to almost talk about ways to be successful in an electrical engineering career and kind of align the focus of recruitment, which is job and career centric, within that particular field? Does that make sense? Like, and here, I guess here's what I'm saying is, like, if I was going to follow a real estate agent, right? Like, or a car salesperson, like, I'm going to necessarily want to look for someone that's not, I don't need them to be Bob Vila, right? Or Grant Cardone, right? As far as like how to actually, sell the vehicle in a sense, or like they need to be, I guess they need to educate me on like, what are things I need to look out for when buying a house? And what are the upgrades I can do to my house to make it more valuable if I'm thinking about selling it, or where am I going to waste money if I'm thinking about upgrades that don't really get like, how do they make me more successful? Like, I think I would tune in more to that real estate agent for that advice versus if I tuned into Bob Vila to tell me actually how to do the upgrade. Am I making any sense here? Are you tracking?
I'm with you, and that's a very good and keen insight, and it resonates with me because across the spectrum of topics, right, it's probably less relevant and maybe even in some ways less credible to be like, oh, I'm all in on electrical engineering as someone who's not technically educated. And yet on the full other end of the spectrum is this sort of maybe swinging the pendulum too far the other direction is just stuff that is more human resources and like purely career oriented. So I think that converging those is really challenging, but possible. It requires a skillful recruiter to do that. And I've seen people who can do that really well. And also, I don't think that the total marketing solution comes only from what's posted on social platforms like LinkedIn. It's a conversation starting element that in the candidate conversations, that's where it really comes alive. Because I don't think for a moment that having a really well-groomed, kind of like if there's a so-called perfect or sterling recruiter marketing approach, it's going to just open doors to conversations with every person. But I do think that it's part of the recruiter's overall developing credibility by using these approaches and creating that voice in their market.
So that's interesting, and a thought that I just had when you were sharing is that it goes along with the cataloging piece, is that if they are also cataloging their industry and resources in their industry, perhaps when they're engaging with their candidates, maybe they could literally just insert a question to the effect of like, hey, what's something that's helped you be successful in your career, right? And if they ask that of all of the candidates that they interview, they're probably going to get a lot of insights about that type of person and what they've done to be successful. And then that's probably could become the outline of content if they wanted to, share information about it on LinkedIn, or they wanted to go do an interview or a talk or whatever their outlet is. They could say, hey, here are the top 10 things that, electrical engineering candidates have told me about how to be successful in their career, right? And they could actually just pull it right out of it, because that's easy, accessible content that the recruiter would have access to, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it's that type of conversation that you just described, which really creates this powerful marketing flywheel, because I'm of the belief, and what I've seen work for other recruiters as well as those whom I've worked with, is when the recruiter is marketing themselves like we've been talking about so far, they're really doing step one in a way. They're creating awareness about themselves in that space and their engagement with that market and that topic. And again, this is all pretty high level. Then, of course, in parallel, they're having those candidate conversations. And while I wouldn't advocate for taking the transcript, so to speak, of a candidate conversation and then upcycling that into content directly because of confidentiality and respect, and
Sure.
it's not all relevant, over time, those accumulations of discussions give the recruiter perspective on how does a 2 to 3 years post-grad engineer develop themselves into a senior engineer or senior project leader. And those insights can then be repurposed into content. Of course, they can be reciprocated back into future candidate conversations. In fact, just as an aside, it's never surprised me. It's always impressed me when potential candidates would ask, hey, Trevor, what's your take? Like, here, we've talked for 20 minutes. Here's where I'm at. I'd like to see myself in a director level position. How do I do that? It's great to be able to add that value to that person because of the time spent in that space. So to your point, Dan, really, that can become and should become content. And maybe it's part of the overall strategy that the recruiter implements, right? It's not all just always technical subjects. It's not all just human resources and career oriented. There's got to be some convergence of the two.
So I agree, and I like how you kind of verbalize what would be a Venn diagram, and kind of what's that sweet spot in the middle, because a lot of that content already exists in that outer periphery. But if you can actually hit that sweet spot and bring in your own unique feedback based on your own experience, like that creates authenticity. So with that, what are some of the outlets? Because again, I'm thinking about this, like most people don't buy a house every few months or every year, every other year. Most people buy a house and it's several years before they buy another one. So the real estate agent doesn't have a lot of repeat customers. They got to focus on referrals, right? To keep that vein going active, right? Same thing with car sales. The typical car sales person buys a car every 5 years, 4 or 5 years is the average, 3 to 4 if you're kind of Toyota or Honda, 5 or 6, it seems to be some of the other brands that I've seen data on. So like the car salesperson, if they stay with it long enough, they can build that book of business where they're going. But in that initial 3 to 4 years, the first most crucial years of their career, like that's got to be about referrals, right? So most people aren't jumping jobs, at least hopefully, at least we try to stay away from, job hoppers, right? Most people aren't jumping jobs every, so often. So how do we create those placements and enough brand equity with the placements that we're making or the candidates we're engaging with to really splinter out or branch out the referral network?
So if I misunderstand the question, please steer me back. So with the marketing activities that this recruiter in theory is doing, knowing that talent doesn't move as frequently as these other industries, how does the recruiter position themselves to be sort of that first choice or that go-to when talent is looking to make, or at least becoming open-minded to make the decision?
Yeah.
Well, it's a good question. It's a broad question too, and I don't want to be so on the nose as to say, this is so obvious, because I don't think it is for everybody. This marketing effort is really about habit forming. It's about building the right habits, and it's about building the right practices that are going to be durable. It's not to say that do this for a year and you're going to be solid, you hit cruising altitude and you won't need to do it anymore. I think today's recruiters should be conscientious that this is an ongoing thing. There's always going to be new insights gained from candidate conversations, movement in the industry that they're focused on, media that they're consuming, et cetera. Things are changing all the time. It'd be hard to find an industry where it's not.
Right.
So by virtue of engaging in this activity regularly, recruiters do distinguish themselves because first of all, it's awareness, so they stay top of mind. Second, it's showing that they are really putting the effort forward to be current. And that is going to resonate with today's talent, because with the number of, and I don't know statistics like you likely would, the number of recruiters who have entered into the space over the last 2-3 years, and sure, there's churn, some will go out, but I do truly believe that talent wants to work with recruiters who they are aware of, they know that they like, or at least could have an affinity for, and feel that they can trust. And you can substitute in synonyms like, it's kind of, oh, I'm aware of this recruiter, I feel that they're credible, so I'm comfortable talking with them. Whereas that talent may otherwise just ignore an email, not pick up the phone, and otherwise like disregard. So it really becomes about developing the right habits, continuing them, engaging with the talent pipeline or pipelines that the recruiter is trying to develop, particularly those that are passive, for when that time comes. There's all this, I think of it like stored equity, or there's all this inherent value that their goodwill that the recruiter has created, where that talent feels, I've never interacted with this person, I'm aware of their name, maybe a colleague has mentioned speaking with so-and-so, I'm going to find them on LinkedIn and give them and make an outreach. And in addition to everything I've just shared, it's like all of that leaves a trail for which talent could find the recruiter. Have you ever had that? It's harder nowadays, but have you ever had that situation where you're trying to recall something and it's like, I can't find it on Google. It's not on my phone. I can't find it on LinkedIn. It's just maddening.
Yeah, the older that I get, that happens more frequently, Trevor.
Same, same. But even with all these resources, it's like the recruiter has created that equity and it makes them easier to find. So there's also more of a path to contact for talent that's becoming curious to find the recruiter. There's all this content out there.
So I love that. And there's kind of two last things I want to explore briefly. One, just a quick question. You mentioned credibility. So where in your guidance to recruiters do reviews come into play? Like, do you work with like the review companies like Great Recruiters that focuses on actually allowing ratings and reviews specific to a recruiter so they can actually, I guess, visualize and kind of marketize, if that's a word, their actual brand and make it visible to the market as far as credibility goes?
No, I'm not working with, I mean, I know the team and I think that they do outstanding work. In fact, I've talked with one of their sales leaders and great conversation. They're making a huge impact, particularly in the healthcare staffing field where trust and credibility is just, I mean, that's the currency of engaging with recruiters after all. When it comes to marketing, it can be a little more challenging because if just take a snapshot of a year's time, if a recruiter contributes 2 or 3 times a week and it's remarkable content, does that therein make them credible? No, there's more to it than that, but will it lift their credibility? Well, certainly. How one measures that? LinkedIn's probably got one of the better algorithmic solutions to answer that question. But to touch on your point, I mean, the recruiters, each recruiter should probably focus on taking initiative to gain those referrals and recommendations from candidates they've placed, certainly, if it's not going to violate any confidentiality with the firm. Candidates whom they got very close to acceptance, but maybe declined for some reason, but with whom they had that great relationship. And there are a host of scenarios where references and recommendations do help lift credibility. And then if the recruiter struggles to do that themselves, yeah, align with the team like great recruiters and use that solution.
I love it. And then the last area that I wanted to explore, because ultimately going back to that, and I hate to keep tying it to the real estate car salesperson and like the infrequency of placing or selling a home or a car to that one person. But ultimately, like if you're in the market for a house, if you've got a real estate agent friend or contact or someone that you go to that like and trust, you're going to say, hey, can you go show me this house, right? But a lot of people don't because you buy so infrequently that you might not have that contact. So ultimately, it's the house that you see that draws your attention. And then you actually will just contact whoever the listing agent is. Same thing with the car. If you go online, you might know a car salesperson and you might want to go to them, but otherwise you might just go look for a car because that's the desired end object. And you might just call the dealership or go find out who's listed and get paired up with whatever salesperson is there. I feel like job searching is the same way. Like people aren't as loyal to the recruiter per se, but they'll say, hey, they'll go look for a job and they'll say, hey, these are interesting to me. I'm interested in this. And they'll just kind of work with whoever the recruiter is that's representing that job, right? So that being said, like that's the framework of kind of the foundation of what I want to dig into. So ultimately, how does the recruiter get the best jobs? Like how do they actually get those jobs to represent that will bring in even more people to look at their jobs that will say, okay, yes, that's then to land on that recruiter, if it makes sense.
I think I understand the question, and it's great that you brought this up because so far we've had a conversation about recruiters doing the marketing efforts and developing those habits to the benefit of connecting with talent. Right. There's the entire hemisphere of client relationship development, and I truly believe that what we've talked about has a significant impact on the potential for developing with new clients because who would be more discerning than a hiring manager who gets an outreach from a recruiter who says they're in their space, who they may or may not have heard before, the hiring manager. And then that hiring manager is going to do a little bit of time due diligence, looking at the recruiter. Do they engage with my niche? Are they connected with people whom I've tried to recruit, who are peers and colleagues of mine? Are they reposting, sharing content that is also content that I've engaged with myself? So when we're discussing credibility, this has a substantial impact on the client development side too. And I may have lost myself a little bit in the question you asked, but I think it's about on how can a recruiter just kind of discern themselves from the masses when it comes to the client side. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, yeah. And
That's
and ultimately, I mean, just to kind of drive home what you mentioned there is like, really, if you're consistently posting, if you're consistently creating that brand authority by being kind of durable, as a word you mentioned earlier, with it and staying with it, you're going to draw more talent to you. But eventually, when you go market your services to a company, you call a prospect and you say, hey, this is, I'm a professional recruiter, I specialize in this. If they go look you up and they see that every single week you're sharing thought leadership about that, and they see that you've got ratings and reviews, and you kind of see that whole marketing brand profile that you talked about, I think that's going to position you as the expert to that client, and it's going to help you acquire that client and give you a better footing of kind of equal footing versus being subservient in their eyes, and is kind of what I took out of that.
Thank you. And yeah, to continue that point a little bit further as well, it'd be foolish to think that marketing in of itself is going to land a new client agreement. But, I've been fortunate enough to have found passion for industry niches along my recruiting journey, semiconductor being one of them. And I was regularly contributing content because I liked the subject matter. I found it engaging, and I wanted to share things that had unique perspectives and or new value. And that attracted interested parties, hiring managers and HR leaders, TA leaders, who wanted to have conversations about their talent needs. Now, that's not to say that that was the be all end all. I mean, there were conversations to be had. We still had to demonstrate capabilities, but rest assured that initial contact came through content. And there are great practitioners of this who are approving this over and over and over again in their spaces in recruiting today.
I love it. I love it. I want to share kind of my big takeaway out of this, because I know that most people looking at this interview are going to have that same thought in their head. And I just want to address it, is that most people are going to say, this all sounds great, Trevor, and it makes sense, but how can I take time away from working on orders or filling orders or trying to go get clients to do marketing, right? Like that's probably what's going on in most people's, mental conversation. And I would say that, yes, it's a trade-off, but it's going to add incremental value at a greater level to all of the other orders you get, and how easy it is to get clients later on, and how easy it is to fill those orders based on what you're doing. So instead of actually taking time to fill like this one order, if you focus on your marketing efforts and building that brand equity, it's going to make all of the other ones easier and more valuable. That's kind of my big takeaway. So with that understanding, this becomes a priority because it is a significant value add to all of your recruitment. I'm hitting on the head.
I agree with you. The recruiting leader who first trained me, welcomed me into the industry, inspired me early on in probably week one of training by saying, what you want to do is get the most out of every call, get the most out of every conversation. And that's not just selfish, it's give and take. Right. Give value, gain value. And over time, I extended that into all activities of recruiting. So if a recruiter is considering, am I going to commit 30 to 45 minutes of every morning to engage in these activities? Well, think of it as developing personal brand leads to more knowledge about the industry, leads to more enriching conversations with potential talent, leads to greater credibility and trust, and so on and so forth. So it's really virtuous. I mean, I think we'd be hard pressed to find an activity in recruitment that can't support something down the line, right?
Right. Yeah, I agree. Listen, man, I'm grateful for your time today and just sharing a little bit about what you do at the Refine Group and how you're actually guiding your clients to be more effective recruiters. And I love that you're focusing in that recruitment marketing branding space, because that will add significant value to the recruiter and increase their chances of success. So Trevor, thank you so much for being here. If anyone wants to get a hold of you to follow up with more about this, what's the best way to contact you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn probably 8 to 9 hours a day, so you'll find me there. Trevor at therefinegroup.com is my email address. Feel free to reach out to me there, and I'd be happy to engage.
Awesome. We'll get these links on page, man. Appreciate you being here.
It's really been a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation, Dan. Learned a lot.